Good day, everybody. This is Jerry Green speaking from the Pacific Council in Los Angeles. We are delighted to have an event today focusing on work that the Pacific Council has been involved in for several years. It's a uniquely important topic at a uniquely important time. Before we begin the substance of our conversation on the trafficking of illegal weapons into Mexico from the United States, I'm really honored and delighted to introduce to all of our members Ambassador Carlos González Gutiérrez, who is the new Consul General of Mexico here in Los Angeles. I always say that the consulate in Los Angeles is the jewel in the crown of the Mexican Foreign Ministry. It is an enormous consulate, certainly the largest in Los Angeles, and certainly within the world of Mexican international affairs, a very, very large legation. I once visited the Mexican embassy in Tehran, and it is dwarfed by what's happening in Los Angeles, you can be certain. Ambassador Gutierrez has been a career ambassador since 2011. And having the title of ambassador is a reflection of the high significance that this post has in the United States, in Los Angeles. He has previously served as the Consul General in Austin, Texas, in San Diego, and we in Los Angeles are very lucky to have him. As a reflection of the importance of Mexico, I want to announce very good news that our colleague, Dr. Richard Downey, who's a member of the Pacific Council on International Affairs, is the incoming CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. He is a specialist on Mexico. So it is impossible to devote too much time or attention to Mexico. And as I always tell people, Los Angeles is closer to Mexico City than it is to Washington, D.C. So we have special responsibility and special insights as well. Before I turn it over to Ambassador Gutierrez, I'm going to be dropping off. So I do want to introduce the Deputy Legal Advisor of the Mexican Foreign Ministry in Mexico City, Miguel Angel Reyes. He stepped in at the very last second to substitute for his colleague, Alejandro Celorio Alcántara, who was called in to meet the president, which is, you can't have a better conflict in your time than that. And so, Mr. Reyes, we are delighted to welcome you. Hopefully, we will see you in person in Los Angeles sooner rather than later. And then our presider and the principal investigator of the report that is the focal point of what we want to discuss today is Kathi Lynn Austin, who's the executive director of the Conflict Awareness Project, and she is the principal investigator on this project. Kathi Lynn is the founder and executive director of the Conflict Awareness Project. When in the early days of this project, she and I were emailing back and forth to Khartoum when she was in Sudan. I've said doing her day job. She has multiple day jobs. So any success that we've enjoyed as a result of her expertise, her collaborativeness, her collegiality, and her genuine expertise on this issue. I want to welcome everybody. I want to welcome all of our members. I'm going to move to the side and turn off my camera and my microphone. I want to turn things over to Ambassador Gutierrez. We really do want to welcome you to Los Angeles. You can always call on us, Ambassador, to support your efforts, and we are really very, very pleased and honored to have you here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this event. I'm glad that my friend Miguel Angel Reyes, the Deputy Legal Advisor, is, as we say in Mexico, salvando la plaza. He's very capable and expert on the litigation versus the gun manufacturers. If I may, and I'm also glad that Kathi is participating in this panel. I already took a look at her report there, the Pacific Council report, and I'm glad that both are here to present us their points of view. Thank you, Jerry, for the opportunity to very briefly say a few introductory remarks. And although I do not used to do this, I would like to start by speaking in first person. If you allow me, if you bear with me, for me, it's very significant to be part of this webinar, to be back in LA and having the opportunity of being involved again with the Pacific Council. In 1988, 1989, I did my master's degree at the University of Southern California. And it was thanks to my mentor, Dr. Abraham Lowenthal, who helped me get the necessary funding and support to come here to USC and do my master's degree. And back then, I learned the importance of the diaspora, understood how crucial it was for Mexico to focus on Mexican communities abroad in the United States, mostly. And so those key years for me were crucial in defining the rest of my career. My whole career, as Jerry was saying, has been devoted to Mexican communities and the diaspora and the relationship between Mexico and the United States. So I remember back then in 88, 89, and then later when I was, again, with the help of Abraham Lowenthal, I was sent to Los Angeles for my first tour of duty. I remember we were all talking about the Pacific Council, and we were writing all the initial papers that later brought to fruition such an important institution today. Back then, in the late 80s, we called ourselves proudly Abe slaves. And so it is an incredible honor for one of those Abe slaves to come back to Los Angeles as Consul General. That would be the end of my personal note. Forgive me, I had to share that with you. I'm very honored to be here today. As I said, Miguel Angel is a close friend and an expert on this litigation. To us Mexicans, it's crucial to have open and frank discussions about issues such as the illegal importation of guns into Mexico. As you all know, it's almost impossible to get a gun legally in Mexico, and nevertheless, we have thousands of those guns operating daily in my country and being the source of 70% or so of homicides. We all know in Mexico that the decline that we saw from 1999 until 2004 was suddenly interrupted when the federal assault weapons ban passed by the U.S. Congress in 1994, expired in 2004, and since then, homicides in Mexico have increased dramatically. So I welcome today's discussion. I'm sure, I'm convinced that this is the first of a long series of webinars and meetings that I will have the privilege of participating as Consul General of Mexico in Los Angeles with the Pacific Council, and I thank everyone for your participation. Kathi.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Let me just start by thanking both Jerry and the ambassador for their introductory remarks and for co-hosting today's discussion. The Mexico initiative at the Pacific Council was Jerry's brainchild, and I've had the opportunity in the past to hear insights from the ambassador when the Pacific Council led a delegation to the San Diego-Tijuana border. They have both been truly keen and supportive collaborators on the issues that we'll be discussing today, and I'm sure that we're going to continue on into the future in the same vein. I also want to thank you all for tuning in to today's PAC Council webinar. This is a devastating problem that we're going to discuss impacting both the U.S. and Mexico. the trafficking and proliferation of illegal US guns. In the US, these illicit guns have fueled mass shootings and are a reason that our school kids have to endure gun shooter drills, taking away their time from learning, as well as their sense of well-being and security. In Mexico, it's even worse. We have these guns that have played an outside and egregious role. Sorry, I just lost my video. There I am. They played an outside and egregious role in Mexico's gun violence crisis that has been going on for several decades now. I often hesitate to use US figures because they're often underestimates, but as the ambassador has said, we know that from trace data that's reported at least 70 to 80% of all recovered crime guns in Mexico were guns that were trafficked from the United States. Now, given the scope and the extent of this problem, combating the US crime guns in Mexico requires trailblazing efforts. And that is exactly how I would describe Mexico's landmark litigation in the United States. These efforts are aimed at breaking a logjam that has stifled gun safety and arms control efforts in both countries. Now, I'm a professional who has spent 35 years investigating, documenting, and holding accountable arms traffickers. This has been everything from the sanctioning of Victor Boot and his Merchant of Death networks to having to document the violations of those sanctions in order to bring them to justice, to ensuring that arms middlemen were regulated in the Arms Trade Treaty, which the US government still has not ratified. So I'm keenly aware of the impunity that is enjoyed by the arms traffickers in the United States. And that is why I believe what Mexico is doing is one of the boldest and most hopeful contemporary initiatives to rein in the powerful and politically connected US gun industry. It is far too long, that industry is far too long fixated on profiteering and not citizen safety and homeland security in the United States. Now, before launching into the discussion today, I first want to set a bit of context for that discussion. And to do this, I really want to give a shout out to the PAC Council and the Conflict Awareness Team for all the diligent work on the recent report, or the report that we published last year, that delves deeply into the gun trafficking and the gun violence issues we're discussing today. And that report, referred to by Jerry, is called The US-Mexico Double Fix: Combating the Flow of Guns to Transnational Organized Crime. The PAC Council magazine and website feature this report, as well as a lot of little short videos that break down some of the core issues that is mentioned in the report. Those issues include, for example, explaining the role of straw purchasers and arms traffickers in the illicit supply chains, why the type of guns matter that are being sold in the US, and how trafficked US guns are linked to our current migration crisis. Thematically, that report explains how reducing cross-border gun trafficking is crucial not only for achieving the security goals of both the US and Mexico, but also for curtailing the substantial human suffering and horror caused by the thousands of guns that have made their way over the US southern border every year. The existing data states that there is anywhere from 200,000 to over 700,000 that are trafficked each year. And even at the lower end, that would mean that there's over 500 guns being trafficked daily. The report highlights the stakes involved, which we will discuss today as well, but how the acquisition of illicit US guns has fueled a US drug overdose overdose crisis. Now, fentanyl, a synthetic drug that is coming from Mexico, is the #1 killer of Americans between the ages of 18 to 45. The gun trafficking problem from the US has propelled a surge in irregular migration, and it's caused an uptick in crime in US cities where local criminals have teamed up with Mexican cartels. Mexico is now home to 5 of the most violent cities in the world and ranks among the top most dangerous places for journalists and politicians. But there are good reasons why we should be concerned about this. Mexico is now the US top trading partner. More Americans travel to Mexico than any other nationality. And over 1.5 million Americans live in Mexico. And Mexicans are seasonal workers, are very important to our agricultural sector. Now, there have been some recent accomplishments we can point to in the US and in Mexico that has been aimed at this issue. For example, one of the most notable is the 2022 congressional passage of the Watershed Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Now, for the first time, that made arms trafficking a US federal crime and allowed for a lot more enforcement and Department of Justice resources to be allocated to the problem. At the same time, Mexico has had an uptick in its own strategic enforcement of gun trafficking, and that has resulted in a 65% increase in firearm seizures under the current Mexico administration. Still, from a policy perspective, there are a lot of gaps, and we delve into this in the report. There are the gaps, the constraints, and limited information sharing around the tracing of recovered crime guns, the weak US restrictions on assault weapons and .50 caliber rifles. There is also insufficient resources that have been attributed to US gun dealer compliance enforcement. And that is not hard to imagine given the fact that there are more gun dealers in the US than Starbucks, Subway, and McDonald's entities combined. Our report concludes with a range of counter arms trafficking tools and strategies and over 30 practical recommendations aimed at the two governments, civil society, and the gun industry. Because yes, the gun industry could play a helpful role in addressing the scourge rather than continue to aid and abet it. Now, speaking of the gun industry, we're going to turn to the main program of today. The 2 legal suits that Mexico has filed in federal courts, one in Boston and one in Tucson. And the cases are focused on Mexico's initiative to stop the harm caused by the reckless, negligent, and complicit practices of the US gun-based industry. Now, it's common knowledge that the US gun industry is protected by special interests, political influence, profiteering, and so I really applaud Mexico for its doggedness in piercing the gun industry's long-standing invincibility and moving us all towards greater accountability and justice for victims. So by way of a little background, just this past January, the US Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in Boston, in Massachusetts, unanimously ruled that Mexico's lawsuit against 7 American gun manufacturers and a distributor could proceed forward. This case, Mexico versus Smith & Wesson, is currently being litigated in Boston, and it's a landmark ruling that was issued because since 2005, a specific federal law, the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, also referred to as PLACA, effectively shielded gun manufacturers from liability and facilitating gun violence and gun crimes. This special protection makes it extremely difficult for gun violence victims in the US to litigate against the source of guns, unlike litigation that has taken place in the US previously against big tobacco and big pharma. And 2005 was the same year that the US assault weapons ban expired, which led to a major production of such weapons and their subsequent uptick in the availability on the criminal market in Mexico. Mexico, which has found a way to challenge PLACA and put the onus back on the US gun industry in a groundbreaking way, calling out the immense human and societal costs that the gun industry's design, marketing, and sale of arms has inflicted. Even if Mexico's 2 legal cases meet with challenges, Mexico can be applauded for advancing a compelling narrative that is reverberating loudly. And I've just worked in this community for so long. It's reverberating across the whole of the US, Mexico, the Caribbean, and beyond. That narrative breaks down in a simple way. Strategic litigation is the best rules-based hope to break through US constitutional and political constraints that major criminal enterprises have been effectively exploiting, leading to untold bloodshed and economic damage on both sides of the US-Mexico border. So now let me turn to Miguel Reyes, who has been a key champion of the merits of Mexicans' lawsuit, and who I have also come to admire based on meetings we've had in Mexico City. And I also know his colleague very well, Alejandro Celorio, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but I know he speaks with urgency and from the heart, and I'm sure that Miguel does as well. So Miguel, it's really good to see you again. Last time I was in Mexico City, there was a discussion around the need to call for all of the shareholders to share this problem and to develop a trusted path forward. So let me start there. What progress on the gun violence issue that finally led Mexico to initiate these cases in the US? And what is the primary aim of the 2 cases? In other words, give us the when and the why.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kathi. It's great to see you again. It's, as you mentioned, we had the opportunity to meet here in Mexico City, and we could learn all the outstanding and terrific work of Pacific Council. And let me start by saying that, by congratulating you for the report that you have just issued. It's a really interesting and very useful report for our purpose. I'm really happy to be here. As you may imagine, the Office of the Legal Advisor is in charge of advising. Let me use again what that word. Not only the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Foreign Law, but also our President and some other members of the Cabinet. So right now, as you are aware, we are facing a really anti-immigrant law in Texas, known as SB4. And in the past 72 hours, we have seen several ups and downs in several courts, and in order to determine if that law is still in force. Luckily, we do not have that in California, but right now, Mr. Celorio, Alejandro Celorio, our legal advisor, is briefing the president and some other members of the cabinet. So let me convey his apologies for not being here. But I'm really happy because that's an excellent opportunity to me in order to be once again here with you with Pacific Council. It's great to meet Jerry Green in this exercise, and also to see my friend and colleague Carlos González Gutiérrez. So having said that, also thank you very much, Kathi, for all your initial remarks and the context that you provided, which is really important in order to determine how, when, where did this lawsuit started. And as you may imagine, both Mexican and American societies have faced gun violence since lots of decades before. But there was a key incident that happened in 2019 that was a cornerstone for this strategy, and that was the shooting in the city of El Paso, Texas. As you may recall, a young man that identifies himself as a white supremacist traveled from northern Dallas to the city of El Paso. It was he drove more than 10 hours in order to, and I'm quoting because his manifesto, to kill as many Mexicans as possible. So I'm saying that this was a cornerstone because after that incident in which at least eight Mexican people were killed, some other 8 were really severely injured, we received the instructions in the Office of the Legal Advisor to find some alternatives in order to combat the illicit trafficking of firearms. And what am I referring to when I say alternatives? Because as you may imagine, all the efforts in order to tackle gun trafficking in both of our countries have focused into issues. First, and what the government or what the authorities must do in our respective areas of influence, both bilateral cooperation in order to enhance collaboration in customs, or in order to enhance collaboration in intelligence sharing. But what I want to express is the focus on what authorities must do. And the second part of that strategy has focused on prosecuting the people who use those firearms. So the traditional focus on combating this phenomenon of illicit trafficking of firearms has focused on these 2 main components. But we noticed that there was something that was missing. That's what we call the missing link of this chain of commerce. And that was the conduct of private companies. So why did this happen? Because why did this happen in Mexico? After the El Paso incident, we also suffered several big incidents regarding gun violence in Mexico. And I'm going to recall one of them, which happened in the city of Culiacán in the Pacific state of Sinaloa, in which during the capture of the head of a major criminal organization, we saw a huge display of firepower of criminal organization. And that was really, it was shocking to see in the news how big the firepower was. And we started thinking, why is this happening? Because in Mexico, we only have one store in the whole country that sells firearms, and it only sells, it is run by the Mexican army, and it only sells weapons of relatively low caliber. We are not seeing this huge machine guns or huge rifles that can shoot a helicopter down. So that's when we started an investigation, and we started to see what we could do as an alternative to these 2 main traditional approaches. And you mentioned something that is critical in this lawsuit, Katie, that is the traceability, in which as a result of bilateral collaboration between Mexico and the United States, when a gun is seized in a crime scene or in customs or whatever, when a gun is collected in Mexico by Mexican authorities, we activate some collaboration with ATF in order to know the origin of those firearms. And we have noticed is what you mentioned, that most of the crime guns come from the United States. And first, and one thing that I want to highlight is that by its very own nature of that this phenomenon is illicit, it is really hard to estimate how many guns cross into Mexico illicitly. But even the most conservative, the lowest, the most optimistic statistics are really critical. And we are talking about hundreds of thousands of guns a year. So after identifying that this missing link in the chain of commerce, we noticed that gun companies know or should know where their products end, and they are easily aware that their products are found or are located in the hands of criminal organizations in Mexico. And that's what led us to take action against this particular link in the chain of commerce. Also, there is also a trend in the world that, in general, as a general concept, is that the responsibility of private companies regarding human rights. And this global trend stems from the fact that private companies sometimes have an economic, political, legal power that is higher than some countries. So they must take into they must be taken into account when dealing with possible human rights violation for its conduct. And when we identify is that that these private gun companies located in the U.S., the main gun manufacturers in the U.S., not only design, not only advertise, but also they sell their products engaging in illicit practices in commerce. And that, from our perspective, is considered negligence or a negligent conduct, and therefore they must be held accountable for those conduct, for those activities that privilege the business, the privilege the earnings that they could make, and on the hands or on the bloods of innocent people.
Thank you. Yeah, that the rationale and the reasoning which you've described for us is so potent. So maybe if you can now give us a little bit of brief overview of the two cases, if you can just kind of walk us through what has been the litigation process so far and how that's culminated in this precedent-setting decision by the U.S. Appeals Court in Boston.
Sure. The starting point is that we have two civil lawsuits. One that was filed in September 2021 in Boston, Massachusetts, and the second one that was filed in October 2022 in Tucson, Arizona. The first lawsuit was filed against 7 gun manufacturers and 1 gun distributor located in Massachusetts. And why those 8 private companies were named as defendants in our lawsuit? Well, first is because the weapons, those companies and those distributors produce and sell most of the weapons that are located or that are seized in Mexico. And second, they have their headquarters in the state of Massachusetts, which is also Massachusetts is located in a judicial circuit that is more progressive, that is more that receives better the arguments regarding international and foreign law. So our first lawsuit was filed, as I mentioned, in Boston, Massachusetts, in 2021, and what we discussed before the district court by that time is we filed 2 main arguments. The first thing is that the first obstacle that you may imagine was to overcome PLACA, which is a unique law that does not exist in no place in the world, that no other industry in the United States enjoys as much protection as the gun industry. But the first obstacle was to overcome PLACA because it grants immunity to those private companies against lawsuits like the ones that Mexico filed. We were aware of it, that's important to say, we were aware that the odds were against us because there have been lots and lots of litigation filed not only by victims of gun violence, but also by some other government authorities, cities, counties, even states that have made important efforts trying to stop this illicit conduct of private companies, and those efforts were precisely defeated by PLACA. So we raised 2 main arguments in Boston, and the first one was that PLACA was designed to protect the gun industries when the damages that are suffered by a person who is filing the lawsuit occurred in the United States. And as you may imagine, in this case, in our case, in Mexico's case, the damage is occurring in Mexico, which is a different scope from PLACA, or that is a conduct that was not covered by PLACA. And that's what we call that PLACA was being applied extraterritorially in our case, which it was not permitted regarding this law. And our second argument was that even if PLACA was to be applied in our present case, there were some exceptions because of this illicit conduct that I have just mentioned. There were some exceptions were triggered in our case that should allow our case to continue before U.S. courts. So what did the district court say 1 year after in 2022? The district court issued a decision in which he said, I'm really empathetic with Mexico, I am aware of gun violence. I think that even that gun companies should know where their products ends. But unfortunately, PLACA is an obstacle and they have immunity. So the case is dismissed. So when that happened, we received lots of comments in which a lot of people said, we told you so. We told you so that this was, you were going to lose this one. But of course, the Mexican government was aware that this was a possibility, and we filed an appeal. And actually, when we designed this strategy, we were betting that the Court of Appeals was going to be more receptive than the district court, for the reasons that I mentioned to you, that it's a judicial circuit that is more progressive in this matter. And on January 2024, sorry, a couple of months ago, the decision on appeal was rendered. And first, it was a unanimous decision. The 3 panel judges decided unanimously that the case of Mexico should continue. What were the highlights of this decision? Well, first thing is that the Court of Appeals considered that PLACA was applicable. I mean, our argument of extraterritoriality was not persuasive enough for the Court of Appeals. But what the Court of Appeals stated was that since the companies were aware where their products ended in our case, they aided and abetted criminal organizations for this purpose, and that was an illicit conduct that should allow us to overcome PLACA. So that's where we are right now. The defendant companies are entitled, of course, to file a third petition before the Supreme Court of the United States. And they have announced that they are going to do that on mid-April. So we are ready to continue our litigation regarding the Boston lawsuit. And of course, we're ready to jump into discovery. And in that phase, we are going to find, and I'm going to disclose several things that are going to prove that we are right in our allegations. The second lawsuit is a younger one that was filed in Tucson, Arizona. It was filed against five specific points of sale located in the cities of Phoenix, Tucson, and Yuma, all of them located in Arizona. And that lawsuit was filed against those 5 stores because they sell, or they have sold, the guns that have been recovered in Mexico. They have a high record of selling guns to straw buyers in our case. And of course, in our allegations, they have not been careful enough for this purpose. That lawsuit is on an initial stage in the district court. We have a hearing last February after having a change of the judge in charge of this case. The new judge decided to postpone the hearing that was originally scheduled for last year in order to study carefully the case. And we had a really good hearing. The judge in charge of the case was studying really carefully, was particularly interested on what happened in Boston, And this is pretty interesting because even though both lawsuits are separate, they have independent tracks. They are going to follow its own path, each of them. They are connected on the facts because we are targeting different parts of the commerce. The lawsuit in Boston is targeted against the gun manufacturers. The lawsuit in Boston is targeted against who sell those guns. So we are really optimistic on the result that we have in Boston. We are really optimistic on the results we are going to have in Tucson, Arizona. And we are ready to continue this because, as you mentioned, this is a strategic litigation. Since we started studying this case, it has passed 4 years, and we are just discussing the first issue, which is that if the case should be dismissed, and we have not even reached. We are not close to study the merits. So this is a resistant race. We are going to be talking about these litigations for several years more.
Yeah, so it's very important. I think what's breaking is that the federal court in Boston did not rule that PLACA didn't apply, but you had an exemption and that you met the requirements of that exemption, but also it upheld the legitimacy of your claim, right? That the impact of US guns that are designed, marketed, and sold in such a way to cause harm. And if I recall from my own research, I think after the assault weapons ban was lifted, about 50% of the profits that are made by the gun industry really came later from the Mexico criminal market. So can you tell us then what type of evidence and data you've been able to bring so far to your case, what you're claiming exactly against the arms manufacturer, and then the implications you think of this potential discovery process may have?
Sure. First, regarding the evidence, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we're really looking forward to entering into the discovery phase. When we filed both of our lawsuits, we provided or we invoked certain evidence that was based on traceability data. But of course, once we enter into the discovery phase, what we expect to find really important information on the decisions of the gun companies. And if you allow me to make an analogy, that has already happened with some other powerful industries, particularly the pharmaceutical and tobacco ones, in which after discovery, there were we saw several decisions of their boards in which they were aware of the danger of their products, and even though they decided to continue making business despite this information. So that's what we expect to discover in this stage. So I would not like to elaborate more on this because we're just about to enter into this phase. But what are we claiming? Well, first, I would divide our claims into three general types. The first one is, of course, an immediate stop, that the court orders that all these private companies cease and stop making or engaging into business with these illicit practices. That is an injunction on their activities. The second general claim is that we are requesting general changes in the practices of the industry, and I am going to give you a couple of examples. The first thing is that if gun companies are aware that their products are being transferred illicitly into another country, they could take into consideration some additional safety measures. For example, everybody has a smartphone these days, and these smartphones can be unlocked easily with a fingerprint. Only the person that is authorized to unlock that phone can use it. So why don't we put this thing, a fingerprint detector in the triggers of the weapons? That's technology that already exists. And actually we have some precedents in the industry in which one of the companies that we are suing, Smith & Wesson, in the past committed to put additional safety measures in their weapons, and the other gun manufacturers of the whole industry turned its back against Smith & Wesson for making this progress forward. And what happened? That Smith & Wesson backed down on this effort. So we're requesting that they be more careful when engaging in commerce. Another measure that we are claiming is, for example, that gun companies pay supervisors that could be more careful in working with the whole industry, with point of sale, with intermediaries, with all kind of persons that are engaged in the chain of commerce, and that they could pay these supervisors in order to lessen the possibility that their products end in the wrong hands. And the third claim or general claim that Mexico is raising, of course, as in any civil lawsuit, is a compensation that is to be determined by the court after the evidence that we provide by that time. We estimate, when we filed the lawsuit, we estimated that that compensation should be around the $10 billion figure. And why is that figure, or how did this amount, how did we arrive to this amount? Well, first, because we estimate that the cost of the gun violence in Mexico is around 2% of our GDP. And we consider that if we did not have the necessity to allocate resources to public security in order to combat gun violence, we could use this for education, health, infrastructure, and some other priorities that any country has. But once again, of course, that amount is going to be determined by courts after the discovery phase, after we prove our allegations, after we furnish evidence on what we have spent in order to combat this gun violence. And we are also really optimistic on that.
Great. Well, just as an arms trafficking investigator, I've always relied upon inside sources or inside documentation. So we're really excited that you're able and hoping that you're able to move forward on the discovery process, because I'm sure that's going to reveal a lot more that we all need to understand. I mean, your complaint in the Boston case is, 139 pages, and you spell out the case so eloquently and so much from the heart, in a way, from the Mexico government. But when we get to discovery, I'm sure that, and I'm hoping that we do, we'll get to some powerful, I believe, insight into what has been going on inside the gun industry that has been protected so long.
Right.
Now, this crime gun pipeline from the US doesn't only affect Mexico. It also affects the Caribbean, and we're seeing the byproduct of that in Haiti now. We're seeing that in Jamaica. We're seeing that in other countries. We're also seeing that in Europe. So can maybe you tell us how this crime gun pipeline that you've so incredibly studied and looked at is mirrored elsewhere? And then what are the implications of the Mexican lawsuit for these other jurisdictions potentially?
Sure, and that's a really interesting question, Katie, because we are seeing an immediate example nowadays, that is Haiti. I was reading yesterday some new reports in which the Haiti gang, the violence that Haiti is suffering from gangs comes or is fueled by guns that come from the state of Florida. And of course, as you may imagine, this is no casualty because Florida is the neighbor state of the whole Caribbean nations. So yes, of course, the lawsuit of Mexico will have implications in outside our country. And the immediate effect is going to be in Latin America and the Caribbean, because once a weapon crosses into Mexico, it not always stops its road here in our country, but sometimes it goes out to Central America and South America, but also in the Caribbean. And we have a really strong ally on the Caribbean community, that comprises the countries of the Caribbean, because you can name any country of that region that has seen an increase in gun violence in recent years. Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, as I mentioned, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and also because of the traceability data, all those weapons, it is without a doubt, those weapons come from the United States. So the litigation of Mexico opens a window of opportunity for those nations in order to trigger some additional discussion. And also, if they have evidence, also if they have suffered significant damage, they can also consider filing a new lawsuit pretty similar as the ones that we have in our country. Regarding Europe, that's also really interesting, because Europe, despite having lots of the biggest gun manufacturers, does not have the levels of gun violence, and that's great for them. And but with Europe, Mexico has a different discussion regarding gun violence, and that discussion is that they must. We are pushing some changes in the discussion. We're pushing these discussions in order to obtain some changes in the initiatives that are discussed among the European Union, because once the European gun manufacturers send or import their weapons, they do not care at all where they end. And the El Paso incident is one example of those because it was the shooter in El Paso used a weapon that came from Romania. So it is important that gun companies all around the world, including the European ones, that they be more aware. They get additional responsibility in this discussion because they should make reasonable efforts to control the whole chain of commerce. And we are discussing this in Europe as well, and Canada, which is also a neighbor of the United States, is also seeing some increase in illicit trafficking of weapons. Canada has its own decisions, of course, on how they tackle them. But we are pretty optimistic that they are following the laws of Mexico closely, because of course, as a neighbor country of the United States, we share some of the concerns, and of course we share some of the solutions. And finally, I just want to highlight regarding the United States. Of course, if the gun industry changes its practice of commerce, that undoubtedly it will have an impact among the U.S. Community as a whole. So we expect that this strategic litigation gives us some important changes in the gun industry that could lead us to safer communities, both in the United States, both in Mexico, but also outside our boundaries.
Great. Miguel, you have summarized the issues so thoroughly in such a short time. So we're very appreciative. So I want to open it up now to question and answers. I think the question tool might be off because we're not getting any questions. And I think that might be the reason, but just checking with our staff. But is there anything else while we're waiting to see if we can get a handle on this technical problem? Is there anything else you would want to add?
Sure. Well, first, as I mentioned to you, it's going to be really interesting how the discussions are going to turn in the following, because I was going to say years, but not actually, it's going to be months after the elections in both of our countries. This is a really purely legal effort, of course, but it is also, it involves a topic that is really attractive for politicians. So we expect, of course, to see some discussions in both our countries regarding the laws of Mexico. But I will never get tired of emphasizing, of pointing out that this is not a lawsuit first against the United States. We are not fighting the United States in their courts. We are allies. We are partners. We need each other in order to combat gun violence, because the gun violence, illicit traffic of firearms, provokes or is the source of some other criminal activities, such as human smuggling or drug trafficking. So we are partners, and this is not a lawsuit of the United States against the United States. But also, this is not a lawsuit against the Second Amendment or a lawsuit against the right to bear arms of the America that is enshrined in the American Constitution. And we have seen several people trying to convey that fake idea, because what we are pushing forward is for a responsible commerce of firearms. We are not trying we are not pushing towards a prohibition of the commerce of firearms, but we are in favor of a responsible commerce.
Great. So we now have the first question, and that is, are there indications that the gun industry is actually taking this case seriously?
Sure. I'm pretty sure they are, and we can see that because of the activity that they are having in courts. As I mentioned to you, they have already announced they are going to be before they're going to file a petition of the Supreme Court. This is interesting because once we got the appeal decision in favor of our case, as you may imagine, the case went back to the district court. And so far, the district court has not issued a stay of the proceedings pending the decision of the Supreme Court. So we have had a couple of hearings on the district court level after the appeal. I want to express this, and the lawyers of the gun industry have been, we are aware, we can notice that they are taking this lawsuit seriously. Perhaps at the beginning they did not took this effort seriously, precisely because of the immunity they knew or they think they had thanks to PLACA. But after piercing this law in the Court of Appeals, I think they are changing its mind and they are going to be discussing this issue seriously.
Okay, one final question before I conclude, and that is, so it seems the recent Supreme Court has been expanding gun rights rather than curtailing them. Do you think that this case will come before the Supreme Court, especially the Peel's decision in Boston, or how are you perceiving this issue at this time?
Sure. Well, first, what we expect is that this is not that the Supreme Court is not going to admit this case. I mean, of course, gun manufacturers or any person that is that thinks that an appeal decision is not favorable enough can file a cert petition. But as you are aware, less than 2% of the cert petitions are admitted by the Supreme Court or going to the merits. So we expect that this petition is going to be among the 98% that are going to be rejected, because we do not consider that the appeal decision touched on sensitive matters of constitutional law in the United States. I think that we are convinced that the appeal decision is really well founded on law, and it is not going to be the appeal decision does not raise points of law that deserve the attention of the Supreme Court of one country. So we're optimistic on that as well.
Okay, the U.S. Supreme Court maybe should get out of the gun business and allow the other courts to proceed. So we're very grateful for what you're doing to push these issues at the boundaries. So to conclude, whether Mexico's case succeeds or not, it can really be said that you have brought the gun industry's role in gun violence to the forefront in both countries. Mexico has made its position very clear that there's no solution to its own gun violence problem unless illegal U.S. guns stop reaching its territory. I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar and for the question that was posed. I encourage the members of the Pacific Council to continue to stay tuned to developments around our U.S.-Mexico project. And I also want to thank Miguel, the ambassador, and his colleague Alejandro, who couldn't be here today, for being displaying for us such determination and being strong voices. And I want to thank you to the Mexico government and its people for championing the issues that are also concerning us in the U.S. And I would say that you're well represented by your powerful leadership. That concludes our webinar today. Thanks again and goodbye.